Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you lost, despite saying everything you needed to? That familiar knot in your throat, like every word you spoke somehow distanced you from your own power? Perhaps you're surrounded by loud voices, people who interrupt, mock, dominate rooms with arrogance masked as confidence. And maybe, somewhere along the line, you began to associate silence with weakness, with defeat, with surrender. But what if silence isn't submission? What if silence is strength in its purest, most distilled form? What if, as Nietzsche believed, the real illusion isn't in withholding words, but in believing words themselves grant power? In a society that equates volume with conviction and speed with intelligence, we are conditioned to defend, to prove, to justify. We are taught that being heard is equivalent to being right. But Nietzsche saw through that performance. He understood that those who constantly need to explain themselves are already caught in a losing game, a game dictated not by truth, but by ego. And the ego, fragile and afraid, cannot bear silence. That's why it shouts. That's why it rushes to fill the void. The truly powerful do not speak to be validated. They remain silent because they no longer require validation. This chapter is not about retreat. It's about reclaiming. It's for those who've been overshadowed, dismissed, underestimated. For those whose silence has been misread as submission. And yet, what if the very act of not engaging was your most profound act of resistance? You see, we've been conditioned to believe we must defend ourselves, as if truth alone wasn't enough without our defense of it. But Nietzsche knew the truth doesn't require defenders. It doesn't tremble in silence. It simply is. And those who live in alignment with it, those who carry it quietly, unsettle others precisely because they are no longer trying to win, because they have nothing to prove. When you begin to value silence, you begin to unlearn the compulsion to explain. You realize that your presence alone can be a response. You begin to see what Nietzsche meant by the herd morality, a system built to keep people reactive, seeking approval, chained by the fear of being misunderstood. But silence disrupts that system. It forces others to sit with their own discomfort. It mirrors their chaos. It denies them the predictable script. And suddenly, you're no longer the nice one. You're the mystery, the anomaly, the danger. Because nothing is more threatening to a manipulative environment than someone who doesn't play the emotional game. This chapter is your invitation to step back not out of fear, but out of mastery. Not to retreat, but to reposition. Because silence, when chosen consciously, is not a void. It's a strategy. It's the pause before the shift. It's the space where power accumulates. In the next part, we'll go deeper into Nietzsche's figure of the Übermensch, the one who no longer lives in reaction, but in creation, and understand how strategic silence becomes a form of dominance that reshapes every room you enter. Nietzsche did not write for the crowd. He wrote for the rare individuals strong enough to stand alone, to look into the abyss without flinching, and to emerge with self-created values that defy convention. This figure, the Übermensch, is not a warrior of words, but a master of presence. One who commands by being rather than by speaking, who does not fight to be heard, but becomes undeniable by his very silence. In a world obsessed with explanation, justification, and debate, the Übermensch walks a different path. He does not react, he chooses. He does not argue, he observes. He does not beg for understanding, because he has transcended the need for it. His silence is not void, but structure. It is the absence that shapes perception, the pause that creates tension, the stillness that demands attention without asking for it. Nietzsche saw in the Übermensch a person who has moved beyond the morality of the herd, the one who no longer seeks to please, to fit in, to obey, but who lives according to an internal compass so refined that the noise of the world becomes irrelevant. While the masses measure themselves through how they're seen and how they're heard, the Übermensch is rooted in what he is, and therefore has no urgency to perform. When he does speak, His words land like lightning, not because they are loud, but because they are necessary. But more often than not, he says nothing. And this disturbs people deeply, because silence, when it comes from authority, unbalances all who are still trapped in the need for external reaction. It forces people to confront the absence of approval. It makes them question their power. It makes them doubt their control. Nietzsche's idea wasn't he about being cold or detached. It was about being so internally anchored that you no longer dance to the tune of emotional manipulation. The Übermensch embodies sovereignty. He doesn't get pulled into every battle, not because he cannot fight, but because most battles aren't worthy of him. And this is where true dominance is born from restraint, not aggression. His silence is sharp, selective, charged with meaning. It's not passivity, it's precision. In every conversation, in every encounter, he sees the game, and by not playing, he wins. This is not an ideal of stoicism or suppression. It's radical clarity. Clarity about energy, about self-worth, about the absurdity of wasting power on those who feed on reaction. The silence of the Übermensch is a fortress. Those who try to breach it expose themselves. They become frantic, desperate, unraveling in the presence of a force that refuses to mirror them. The world interprets unpredictability as threat, and so when your silence no longer fits the script they expect from you, they panic. But you, if you are to walk this path, must not. You must remain still, centered, grounded, not as a tactic, but as a state of being. This chapter is about embodying the kind of power that doesn't fluctuate with opinion, the kind that doesn't bend to pressure, the kind that speaks even when silent. In the next part, we'll enter the psychological battlefield, where silence doesn't just command respect, but triggers chaos in those who rely on your reaction to feel in control. Prepare to see what silence does to the mind of the manipulator, the insecure, and the emotionally dependent. Silence is not neutral. It's a mirror, a force that reveals more than any word could ever hide. When you choose not to react, not to explain, not to defend, you aren't just withholding noise, you re-triggering a collapse in the minds of those who need your reaction to feel in control. Psychology shows that in moments of confrontation, silence is not perceived as absence. It is interpreted as judgment, power, even threat. And those who speak only to maintain dominance feel this most acutely, because when you do not give them feedback, they're forced to face their own echo. Their insecurities rise, their thoughts spiral, and in the void of your response, they begin to imagine, to project, to unravel. Nietzsche, long before cognitive science caught up, understood this. He saw that people speak not to connect, but to protect. Every sentence is a shield, every explanation a plea for validation, every argument a desperate dance to avoid silence, because silence strips them naked. And what's exposed isn't just the argument, it's the self. That's why manipulators panic when you go quiet. They need your reaction to anchor their illusion. Your silence breaks their narrative, reveals their games, and worse, it makes them feel invisible, irrelevant. That's what hurts the ego most, not criticism, not even rejection, but indifference. Your silence says, "You are not important enough to disrupt my peace," and that, to a manipulator, is unbearable. But this silence is not easy. It is uncomfortable. It feels like betrayal, even to yourself, because we've been conditioned to believe that not responding is weakness, that being calm is cowardice, that silence is giving up. But this is the lie of the emotionally dependent. True power is not the power to speak, it is the power to choose when not to. And if you do this with clarity, you'll begin to notice something remarkable. People expose themselves when they talk too much. They reveal their needs, their vanity, their fragile center, all while you remain still, not passive, but sovereign. This psychological warfare is not about manipulation. It is about liberation. You are no longer trapped in their game. You see it. You name it. You walk away from it. And that in itself, is a revolution. In the next chapter, we'll turn silence into strategy. You will learn how to use this absence, not just to protect yourself, but to dismantle the entire dynamic. When your silence becomes intentional, it doesn't just avoid conflict, it wins it without speaking at all. It is not enough to understand the power of silence. You must learn how to wield it with precision, not as a passive withdrawal, but as a deliberate strike. Because silence, when intentional, becomes a blade sharper than words. And the first rule is this: remain silent when every part of you screams to respond. That's when the silence is most powerful, when it defies your own ego, your own conditioning, your reflex to be understood. The second rule is observation. While others spill their insecurities dressed as opinions, you watch like a hunter tracking a pattern. You're not silent because you're afraid. You're silent because you're calculating, absorbing, waiting. Every contradiction they utter becomes a map of their psyche. And when you finally speak, if you speak at all, it cuts with surgical clarity. The third rule: let silence linger. Most people fear silence because it forces them inward, so let it stretch. Don't fill the void. Let it grow. The longer you wait, the more pressure builds, and pressure reveals. It exposes weakness. It creates tension. And tension is power. The fourth rule: become unpredictable. When you master silence, no one knows what you'll do next. You become unreadable. And unreadable people are always feared, because fear thrives in uncertainty. Your lack of reaction rewrites the script. People begin to walk on eggshells, not knowing which version of you they'll encounter. This reverses the dynamic. You are no longer responding to energy. You are setting it. But remember this: silence is not passivity. It is composed intensity. You are not retreating. You are positioning. You are conserving power. And when the time comes, when the silence has done its work, you deliver your words like a verdict, not to provoke, not to explain, but to end. And in many cases, you won't need to say anything at all, because by the time you choose to speak, the battle has already been decided. But we must be careful, because there is another form of silence, one that looks similar on the surface, but is born from fear, not strength. And that silence isn't power, it's a quiet surrender. That's what we'll confront next. There is a silence that empowers and a silence that enslaves. And if you're not careful, you'll confuse the two. You'll think your avoidance of conflict is maturity, when in fact it's fear. You'll believe your calmness is a strength when it's been conditioned submission. Have you ever noticed how people begin to dominate spaces you no longer defend? How they interpret your silence as consent, your patience as weakness, your peace as passivity? That's not harmony, it's self-abandonment in disguise. And the more you avoid discomfort, the more comfortable they become using you. Nietzsche called this slave morality, the moral code designed by the weak to survive the strong, built not on virtue, but on resignation. It's the morality that rewards self-erasure, that calls guilt a compass and compliance a virtue. But he didn't write for those who surrender. He wrote for those who dare to rebel against this invisible prison. The problem is not your silence, it's the reason behind it. When your silence comes from fear, from guilt, from the desire to not upset others, you are not mastering yourself, you are losing yourself. You are shrinking to fit into spaces too small for your truth. And every time you do, your power is redistributed to those louder, bolder, more willing to occupy what you vacate. They don't need to silence you. You do it for them. And they reward you with temporary acceptance until they don't need you anymore. The true will to power, Nietzsche said, is not domination over others, but mastery over the self. That begins when your silence is no longer an apology, but a declaration. Not a retreat, but a boundary. Not invisibility, but undeniable presence. This is the silence that changes rooms. That shifts dynamics. That commands without a word. But how do you make that shift? How do you go from being silenced to being sovereign? From shrinking in guilt to radiating authority? It begins with what Nietzsche called the Übermensch, the one who transcends the morality of the herd and writes his own values into the world. We spoke of him before. Now, in the final chapter, we'll explore how to become him. Because the world doesn't need another obedient voice. It needs your dangerous silence. This is the final chapter, and if you've made it this far, it means something inside you is already awakening. You're beginning to understand that silence isn't emptiness. It's power. It's clarity. It's control. Nietzsche never wrote for those content with comfort. He wrote for those ready to transcend it. The Übermensch, the overman, is not someone who dominates others, but someone who has stopped being dominated by his own impulses. He has mastered the chaos within, and because of that, cannot be manipulated by the noise outside. This is not just about silence. It's about presence. The kind of presence that needs no explanation, no justification, no defense. The Übermensch does not stay silent out of fear, but out of sovereignty. He speaks only when speaking is necessary. And when he does, every word lands like a stone in still water. His silence says what words cannot. I am not here to be liked. I am here to be. He no longer seeks validation. He no longer reacts. He no longer chases approval or avoids rejection. He creates his own code, his own values, his own truth. And because of that, he terrifies the world. Because he cannot be controlled, guilted, or shamed into submission. And here's the part you must understand. This path is not easy. Choosing this type of silence means you will be misunderstood, judged, perhaps even feared. But it is better to be feared for your depth than loved for your compliance. Better to walk alone in truth than surrounded in lies. The Übermensch knows that discomfort is the price of evolution, that solitude is the fire in which strength is forged. That respect is not demanded, it is earned in silence. And so I ask you, not rhetorically, but as a mirror, are you ready? Ready to stop reacting, stop pleasing, stop betraying yourself for approval? Ready to replace apologetic silence with the commanding silence of someone who knows their worth? Then write it now, out loud or within. I choose the silence that commands respect, not for the world, for you. Because the world will keep shouting. The only question is, will you react or will you reign?